But this morning, we're going to look at a topic called the weight of the world. And sometimes we encounter circumstances in life. I know some of you have experienced deaths in the family recently. Others of you have experienced loss due to COVID, maybe job loss. Maybe it's a loved one or a friend that passed away over the last few months or the year. Maybe you've just been through some real times of change in life or hardship or, emotional struggles with anxiety or depression or all kinds of different things. Life gets hard and life gets heavy. I want to show you this picture. It's kind of an amusing picture. I'll kind of step out of the way for a second so you can take a look at it. But this man here, he's an Austrian man, and according to the official Guinness Book of World Records, this is Franz Muellner, and he supported an average of 1,234 pounds on his shoulders. That's a lot of weight. The only way that he was able to achieve that was by putting this frame onto his shoulders and having a helicopter actually land on top of the frame for 30 seconds. And he actually held the weight of this entire helicopter. He actually brought another helicopter that was almost 700 pounds heavier in 2017 to try to beat his record. And he held it up just before collapsing, but he had to hold it up for a specific period of time in order to get the Guinness Book of World Records record. And so he didn't beat his own record. But he's a guy who knows a lot about carrying weight on his shoulders, the weight of a helicopter on his shoulders. And as I mentioned, sometimes life feels like that. It's burdensome. It presses down on us. We had an experience as a family a few weeks ago, and some of you know about it. Many of you probably don't. But our son, Makai, had struggled with, he's a 4-year-old, with what we thought was a hernia of some sort. But we'd never had it diagnosed. It was never able to be diagnosed, and it was trapped in one place, and he was in excruciating pain about 4 weeks ago, and so we had to run to the ER. It took them about 30 minutes to get this back in place, to get his intestines back up inside of his abdomen, back into place and get him out of that. And if they wouldn't have been able to write that, we would have faced emergency surgery right there. Thankfully, they were, but we still have a surgery that's ahead. In fact, that's going to be coming up next week. And so after Easter, the week after Easter on April 7th, we get to take our 4-year-old through a surgical experience. And that, as a parent, that's so much weight. And I can't even relay the way that I felt inside my heart driving my 4-year-old to the ER, to the hospital, and just with uncertainty ahead and seeing him in so much pain. And it's so hard when you can see that and you're feeling that and life is pressing in on you and all these emotions are coming out and you feel completely powerless to do anything about it. And as a believer, we have God to lean on through that. But it doesn't mean that the experience is easy and we still feel that weight. And it was interesting because I can identify, I feel like better with one of the experiences of Jesus just shortly before his crucifixion. One of the experiences in the Bible I can probably identify with better this year than at any other point in time because of the similarity. And that was Jesus' experience in the Garden of Gethsemane. So we're going to talk about this morning. And Gethsemane, it says in Matthew chapter 26, then Jesus came with them, with his disciples, to a place called Gethsemane. And this was right after the Last Supper was celebrated, right after Judas left to get a group of soldiers to come and arrest Jesus. He was about to betray Jesus. And before that could all take place, Jesus walked out of the city of Jerusalem, down the Kidron Valley, up the other side onto the Mount of Olives. It was about a mile or a mile and a quarter away, so, not too far of a walk. Onto the Mount of Olives, this ancient grove of olive trees. You can still see that in Israel today if you visit there. I don't know that the trees date back to the period of Jesus, but they're old trees, and it was a garden back then. Not only was it a garden, but Gethsemane, it's actually a Hebrew term that was transliterated. We say Gethsemane, but it's actually Gath Shemanim. It means the olive press, the oil press. And I feel like this is, again, a very fitting thing because Gethsemane itself, it really depicts the burden that was weighing down Jesus' soul. It's a visual for us, and we don't catch it because we don't know Hebrew, but if we know the language behind it, we see that. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. I want to show you a couple of pictures. Well, one picture. This is what an olive oil press looked like back in Bible times. Now, you may have seen the wheel with the donkey, pulling the wheel around, crushing the olives. That was the first part of the process. But after they crushed these olives, they would put them into a press, and you can see a beam behind me. There's a pit with 2 rocks, and those rocks were weights pulling the beam down. And on the other end of it, there was a large stone, and there's kind of a black round thing. And that's a basket that contains olives. And so the press was this weight, and it was just smashing this basket of crushed olives as forcefully as it could in toward the ground. And then the olive oil would drip out into that vat structure, the 2 holes that you see kind of behind in the background. And so that pressing, that was where Jesus was. But it was really an illustration of everything that Jesus was feeling internally at that moment. It was a planted place, an olive tree grove, again, about 351 feet in height above this valley on the side of a hill. And that's where Jesus chose to go and spend some time in prayer and to take his disciples. It says next, he said to the disciples, sit here while I go and pray over there. So they show up at this olive oil press site. And he tells 8 of his disciples, because Judas is out of the picture. He's going to betray Jesus. So there's 8, and then there's a group of 3 as well. Jesus kind of inner circle, the closest friends, Peter, James, and John. But he tells 8 of them, sit here while I go over there. And then it says in verse 37, he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. And sometimes we get to this period of time in our lives, again, when we feel pressed. And that word for deeply distressed, it's the most severe word in the Greek language the Bible's translated from, the New Testament's translated from, for depression that you can possibly come up with. And so think of words like chronic depression or debilitating depression, those types of words that we would use today. And that's what Jesus is feeling. The word literally means flooded with loathing, with anger, with detesting everything about the situation that you're in. And that's the way that Jesus felt about everything that was upon him. He detested the way that he felt and the weight that was on him. It says in verse 38, then he said to them, these 3 that he brought closer to himself, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful. And the word exceedingly, it means surrounded by. And so every kind of sadness that you can imagine, every kind of grief, it's coming at him from a physical level. He probably feels sick to his stomach at this point. Mentally, it's overwhelming. Emotionally, he can, again, feel it. Relationally, he feels that tension. Spiritually, all these different aspects. It feels like everything is just immersed and flooded in sorrow. It says, even to death. So inside, he feels like his soul is dying. And maybe you've experienced that kind of deep grief before in your life, or maybe you're feeling it right now, and you think, can anybody ever relate to me? Why do I feel this way? And that's the way Jesus felt. He felt like his soul was withering inside of him. It was literally dying, spiritually. So what was there for him to detest? What was weighing down on him? Scripture gives us a great picture of that. In fact, it tells us in John 18:4, it says, Jesus knew everything that was coming upon him. So by this time, Jesus is aware of what's coming down the pipe. He knows he's about to die, but there's so much more than that that's involved. He is aware of how some of these specific prophecies in the Old Testament that focus on what his suffering will be like, how they're going to play out. And he knows that this applies to him, and he knows that it's imminent. It's just around the corner. Things like Isaiah 53, where it says, he, this Messiah who is to come, he was pierced for our offenses. He was crushed for our wrongdoing. So he knows that he's about to be pierced with these nails of the cross. The punishment for our well-being was laid upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. So he knew he was about to have the weight of the sins of the world put upon his shoulders. It's one thing to hold up a helicopter. It's another thing to hold up the sins of humanity, all humanity, as a perfect and sinless and holy God. And all of that was weighing down on him. It says in Isaiah 53:6, all of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the wrongdoing of us all to fall on him. And so again, all that imperfection, all of that disgust, it was on him. And so it wasn't just, it was an emotional turmoil that he was going through, and like anything that we can relate to. Isaiah 50, verse 6, it says, I gave my back to those who strike me and my cheeks to those who pull out my beard. I didn't hide my face from insults and spitting. So he knew he was about to be stricken with this whip, this cat of nine tails, and whipped, flogged. He knew he was going to have his beard pulled out. People were going to insult him and spit at him. Psalm 22, it's another foreshadowing of this experience where David writes, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Jesus cries that out just before he gives up his spirit on the cross. So he knew that this relationship that he had experienced within God, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, there was going to come a point when that was going to get disrupted, and he was going to be forsaken from the Father and the Spirit at a point in time. Something he had never, ever experienced as God. Something that we can't imagine what that feels like. He would experience that separation. He says, my God, in Psalm 22:2, I cry out by day, but you don't answer. I'm a worm and not a person. And that was what Jesus was feeling. A disgrace of mankind and despised by the people. All who see me, they sneer, they shake their heads, saying, let the Lord save him. I'm poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart feels like wax. It's welting inside of me. My strength is dried up like a dry piece of pottery. That's what he was feeling, and that was the weight that was upon him. That was the pressing. So he was like the basket of olives, and all these things were like that heavy stone that was being weighed down by a beam and heavier weights just crushing into him. That's what he felt like. And so if you've ever been there and you feel like no one else can identify, Jesus can, and in so many more ways, even than that. But he felt the most severe depression that you could even imagine at this moment in the Garden of Gethsemane. One of the encouraging things, I think, was that he wasn't alone in this experience. And there was a moment when the Father looked away. The Father forsook him because of the sins of the world that were upon him. But even in this moment, he wasn't completely alone because he had these 11 other followers, these disciples, for a source of encouragement. And I think that's important for us to remember as well when we go through these severe trials and situations. God oftentimes puts people in our lives around us to be with us and help us walk through that. It says as well in verse 37, Jesus said to the disciples, sit here while I go and pray over there. And so again, he took 8 of them and he said, sit out here. One of the other Gospels tells us that he went about a stone's throw away. And so I don't know how far a stone's throw away is for you. For me, probably maybe the back of this room. Maybe you could throw it twice as far, 3 times as far. But Jesus went, maybe 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 yards away in this olive grove, away from the main group of disciples. But these 8, they were still aware that Jesus was suffering. They knew that his death was imminent because he had told them just before they left to cross the Kidron Valley into the Garden of Olives to Gethsemane. He told them what was going to happen. In fact, in verses 31 to 35 of this same chapter in Matthew 26, it says, Jesus said to them, to these disciples, all of you will be made to stumble because of me tonight. It's written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. That was a prophecy in Zechariah 13. So he said, someone's going to strike me. I'm going to die. That was what strike meant back then. And you're going to be scattered. The flock will be scattered. But he says, after I've been raised, I'll go before you to Galilee. And then Peter says, even if everybody else stumbles, I'm not going to stumble, Lord. You're not going to make me stumble. And he tells him, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter says, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And it isn't just Peter. All the other disciples are like, we won't leave you. We won't forsake you. And so they know what's happening, but they don't know the full extent of what's happening, these 8. They're close, but they're not extremely close. It's kind of like the people that you know in life. They may be acquaintances, but they're kind of like people who are on standby. If you need anything, let us know. We're here for you. But yet, maybe you're not close enough to really expect to be called on. And it's important to have people like that because sometimes you do need like a wider group of people for support. But oftentimes you rely on the people who are closest to you. And that's what we see happens with Jesus in this situation as well. It says in verse 37, he took with him, so a stone's throw away, he takes him further, Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, James and John. And that's when he starts to get sorrowful and deeply depressed. It's not in front of the whole big group. It's when he's got the 3 closest friends to him. John's called the disciple that Jesus loved. I mean, they were tight. They had a close, tight-knit friendship, these 3. They got to do certain experiences that the other disciples weren't a part of. And so they were really close with each other. And to them, they get to see the depth of his distress. When I was in college, I was in a dating relationship for about 1.5 years. And there came a point where I broke that relationship off. And, that was a difficult place to be at in life. And it left me with a lot of uncertainties. And obviously, over time, God worked things out. About 10 years after that point in time, I met my wife, Christine. And I'm glad that God brought me to her and did the things that he did and brought me out here to Utah and changed a lot of circumstances. But if you've ever gone through a breakup before, you know that's a rough place to be. And I can be kind of a private person when it comes to these difficulties that I go through. I don't necessarily tell the world about my problems. I want a few close friends. And so I got one of my closest friends in college. He and I went and grabbed some coffee, and I just needed somebody to listen. And so I kind of explained this decision that had been made and what I was going through and experiencing. And he listened to me, and he said, you know what, let's catch a movie. Let's get your mind off of this. You're going through a tough time. And so he took me to this movie, and it was supposed to be kind of an adventure-based, more like guy-oriented movie. There's only one problem. One of the subplots in the movie was about a guy whose life was devastated by a relationship breakup. And he just looked over me at that point in the movie. He didn't know it was coming. He's like, sorry, Jay. It's okay. So maybe after that point, it became a little more difficult for me to let people into my life. But that's still the way that I operate today. If there's something that I'm really dealing with and it's very personal, then I want to let a few people in on it, the people who are closest to me. And with these 3 closest friends, he did a few things. One, he tells them, can you stay near me, abide with me, or stay with me? I think this translation that we're using on the screen says. So he says, I want you to be present with me. I need you here. And sometimes it's not about what you have to say or your words of wisdom. It's just about your presence with someone. And he goes over maybe a few feet or a few yards away from them and really prays fervently to the Father. He's not right with them, but they're close. You know, they're really close to him. And he also gives them a window into his soul. He's willing to open up. And I think it's important when we're going through these tough times that we do have humans, people, you know, even other than God, actually human people that we can face-to-face open up with and say, you know what, this is where I'm at. This is what I'm feeling. It's what I'm experiencing. And what he really hopes, I think, is to draw strength from their support. He wants them to, he says, stay awake with me. And stay awake, it can be used literally, like don't go to sleep. And I think that was probably part of the intention in the Garden of Gethsemane. And if you look forward a few verses, you realize that they fall asleep. But the other meaning of that, kind of the metaphorical meaning of that, is be vigilant with me. Stay with me, stay acquainted, connected with me and what's going on. Like stay in contact with me. Be supportive of me. And so I think he was really hoping for support from them during this period of time. But it says in verse 40, then he came to his disciples and he found them sleeping. So he goes off to pray, talks with the Father for a little while, and we'll come to that prayer in just a moment. But when he comes back after maybe an hour or so, he finds them asleep, these 3 closest friends. And because of their own personal grief, Luke 22:45 says it wasn't just because they were sleepy, it was because they were exhausted from their own grief. They were grieved because they knew Jesus was facing death imminently, and all that, you know, had brought them into this state where they were kind of feeling depressed themselves, and they were really struggling to be these devoted, supportive friends because they were struggling themselves. But maybe it's important at that point when we're helping friends through things, even if someone we love and we know is suffering and their suffering is affecting us and it's hurting us, to try to remember, you know, to try to muster the strength that we have, which is kind of the way this passage presents it, to remain, you know, in there with that person and not just completely go off into this aspect where we're kind of focused on ourselves and we forget what our friend's dealing with. We're just focusing on how that affects us. You know, don't just go there. It's okay to feel that way, to feel those effects, but don't disconnect from the person who is suffering even more than you are. You know, be there for them during this time. And this is kind of an ironic situation that they fall asleep, because just an hour previously, what were they telling Jesus? If everybody else walks away from you, I'm not going to walk away. I will die with you. If I can just stay awake. You know? Their heart is there. Their spirit's willing, Jesus says, but their flesh is weak. I also think it's key to look at what Jesus does here, because oftentimes, again, when we're feeling so much pressure, so much depression because of what we're dealing with, we're almost consumed in our own circumstances and we don't look around us. I was having a conversation with a friend just a week ago who's been through just a lot of difficulties over the past several months, even the last year. And he was talking about how one of the really neat things that God has done through that is God has caused him to look around and see other people's needs as well. Because he realized, I'm not the only person suffering. There's other people who are suffering, you know, like I am or differently than I am, but there's other people going through this kind of thing too. And so he's become more aware of needs, and he actually wants to meet other people's needs because he understands what it's like to go through difficult times. And we see that of Jesus as well, because Jesus could have said, you know, why are you guys asleep? It's all about me, you know. But he actually takes time to do what he's always been doing with these disciples. He always teaches them. He's trying to help them grow in their faith. And he says to Peter here directly, he says, what? Could you not have watched or stayed awake with me 1 hour? Watch and pray so you don't enter into temptation. And then that line, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so he's taking his eyes off of himself and all of this weight and all this suffering. And he's saying, Peter, you better be careful. Temptation is going to get the best of you. And he's warned Peter already, and Peter said, no, I don't need to be concerned. I'm with you, Lord. I'll never deny you. But Jesus is just subtly reminding him, and he's in the midst of his own pain addressing Peter's need. Peter needs deliverance too, deliverance from temptation. Jesus wants deliverance from the pain and the suffering, but Peter, he needs deliverance in a different way. And Jesus actually notices that need and meets it. And I think that's key as well when we're suffering, to look around us and, realize other people have needs too, and ask how we can meet that. The last thing I want to look at for just a few minutes this morning are some practices. And I'm going to go on a limb here and tell you some Jason theory. This is not like hardcore fact. It's not biblical truth, but I'm going to give you some of my thoughts that I think might play into this passage in a moment. And it has to do with practices. I have a friend who I met in college, but now he's stationed overseas, and he's part of a team that oversees an international staff for a global humanitarian organization. And part of what he does is his goal and his team's goal is to help the staff that are placed in very hard countries around the world actually thrive in these difficult places, thrive in their lives, move kind of from being sick to being well to being really good to thriving, like as far as their health in a lot of different ways, physically, emotionally, relationally, mentally, spiritually. And so to do that, what he challenges these humanitarian workers around the world who are disconnected from maybe friendships and people who can empathize with them, again, living in these different cultures. He challenges them to do some very simple things, put some simple practices in your life so that you move toward a better place, so that you can thrive even though there's difficult circumstances pressing in on you all the time. Some of those are physical, and they're simple. Eat right, move every day, and rest. Don't forget to take time out to do that, because whether it's in an international place or maybe in your own life, if we let's lose sight of those things, we kind of devolve into unhealthy habits. Cognitively, he says, don't forget to keep learning. Find something that you're interested in. Always have something that you're interested in, and don't forget to play. It's important to have ways to play. We're great at that as kids, but when we get to be adults, we forget about that. As far as our emotions, he challenges these workers to interview themselves, ask them, how do I feel today? How am I actually feeling? We don't stop to do that sometimes, and these workers don't. And then to kind of come to terms with why that's happening. Relationally, to invest in other people's lives, and spiritually, to withdraw, to spend time with God, but also to gather with other believers for encouragement. Those are some very simple practices, but they go a long way in providing stability and familiarity and being intentional about growth in people's lives. And in Jewish people's lives at this time, the time of Jesus, they had some practices, some habits, some routines built into their daily lives as a whole society. And again, the point of that was to allow them to focus on God, to bring their attention towards specific things about God on a daily basis, to add some stability to their lives, some familiarity, and just keep them connected with God. Today we might call it liturgy, we might call it rituals, but the Jewish people had these habits built into their lives. And one of the things that Jesus routinely does, Luke 22:39, it tells us that. It says, Jesus went out and made his way as he customarily did to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And this is speaking about this same night when he went to Gethsemane. And so it was Jesus' custom to go to Gethsemane, certainly to go out to the Mount of Olives. And it seems like because of the way that Judas so easily found him to betray him, he did this for evening prayer. And so I'm going to make a slight assumption here, but I think, again, it's supported in Scripture, that Jesus has a custom, and that custom is a prayer custom, and he uses the Mount of Olives as a place quite frequently, and probably Gethsemane, to go out for evening prayer. Why? There's something culturally that takes place. There's a prayer in the Jewish nation, they still recite it today, called the Shema. The Shema, it's selections from Deuteronomy and Numbers in the Old Testament, but it really centers them in on who God is and who they are. And it was something that every Jewish male who was considered to be keeping God's commands, and we know Jesus fit into that, like he was a Jewish man, he was very committed to God as God in the flesh. He was very committed to God's commands, and he was part of Jewish culture. Every Jewish male was responsible for doing it. And Jesus wasn't just a Jewish male. He was a rabbi. He was a teacher. And so I think it's pretty safe to assume that Jesus had this habit in his life. And I want to read to you from a document. It was put down on paper, so to speak, in the 200s AD, so about 150 years after Jesus. but it was something that where they had sayings from a lot of the rabbis that were in Jesus' time, in Jesus' day. And again, the Shema, I'll share that with you in a moment. It's just a few passages from again, the Old Testament. But it says in this document called the Mishnah, again, written in the 200s AD, it says, from what time does one recite Shema in the evening? From the time that the priests partake of their wave offering until midnight. And so every evening before Jewish men went to bed, they would take time out and they would recite these specific verses from a few places in the Old Testament. And they were supposed to do it, again, before midnight. This is something that's very prevalent in Jesus' day. They also had to recite the exact same scriptures every morning before 9 o'clock in the morning. And that was their habit if they wanted to be religious people. And so what I'm jumping out on a limb here, what I'm proposing to you is that I think that Jesus went out to the Mount of Olives in the evening after dinner with his disciples before bed, because that was his habit whenever he was in Jerusalem, to go out to the Mount of Olives and to recite these prayers from the Old Testament and focus his attention in on that. And there's a reason why I think that, and that's because Jesus' submission to the Father, what's he say? Not my will, but your will be done, right? That's his big line from these prayers. And I think that's his response to what he's reciting back to God the Father from the Old Testament. It says again in verse 39 of our chapter, Matthew 26, Jesus went a little farther, fell on his face, and he prayed, saying, "Oh, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, this experience, these circumstances I'm about to encounter. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And so he's submitting himself to the Father's will. And the whole purpose of these prayers, these scripture verses from the Old Testament, was to remind Jewish people of their relationship to God. God is the king and they are the servants. And he is only king as far as they allow him to rule, right? If you're a king and nobody lets you rule them, you're not a very good king, right? And so the Jews recognize part of allowing God to be king and part of saying God is our king is us doing what God says, right? Us following God's commands. And that's the whole way that this Shema prayer is presented. I want to read a portion of it to you. Here's how it starts in Deuteronomy chapter 6. "Hear, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." You recognize those words, right? Jesus said that was the greatest commandment, right? "These words which I'm commanding you today shall be on your heart." And it goes on to talk about how you should share it with your family, when you're walking on the road, when you lie down and when you get up. And the Jewish people took that phrase, "when you lie down and when you get up," quite literally. And so they would pray these words to remind themselves of the importance of interacting with God's commands when they lay down and when they would rise up. Moving on to Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 and following, it talks about how there are blessings that are attached to obeying God's will. And then finally, the prayer moves on into Numbers chapter 15. There's about 4 or 5 verses from Numbers 15. And at the end of that, it's a place where God is reminding them. He had this symbol. They would put tassels on the bottom of their garments. And so, the threads that are tied together kind of at the top that would hang off. And that was to be a reminder to them. There was a blue thread down the middle. And a lot of Jewish scholars and people believe that the blue thread was representative of divine glory, God's divine glory. And so when they looked and they saw these little tassels, it was supposed to remind them to keep God's commands. That's what the tassels symbolized. And the blue thread was the reason why, because it gives God glory. And so they would look down at their garments and they would be reminded every evening and every morning as they prayed that, I'm here to follow God's commands to give God glory. And I think that while I can't prove it, if that's what Jesus went through, those verses about love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, follow his commandments, he will bless you. Remember, look down at your robe, Jesus. There's those tassels that are there because you are God in the flesh and you're going to keep all of God's commands and you are seeking God's glory. I think maybe that was going through his head at this point in time, and maybe what the disciples were supposed to be praying as well at this point in time. But I think Jesus was focused in, because of that practice, on how he could carry out God's will. And so despite the fact that life was so filled with turmoil and he was being pressed in every direction, this prayer habit, this practice, and even the words of it, these specific scriptures he was praying, helped him really focus on why he was here in the first place and what he was going through. And that, again, is to carry out God's will. And it was very common as people would pray this kind of recited prayer every night, they would put in their own prayers, their response to it, their own thanksgivings, things that they had as far as requests. They would also share that. And so Jesus is probably carrying out a dialogue with the Father as well, but he's processing everything that these scriptures are directing him to do, and that's submit to God's will in light of his present circumstances, which is, you're going to die for the sins of the world the next day on a cross and be cruelly mistreated. You're going to be separated from me. And I think that prayer enabled Jesus to not only realize God's will, but also accept God's will. Because you see this process, we only get the dialogue about Jesus asking the Father's will to be done, but from that dialogue that we have in Matthew chapter 26, this is what we get. The first thing Jesus says is, "Oh, my Father, if it's possible, if it's in your power, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done." And so at first, he's looking at the circumstance kind of as we would, going, you know what? God might be able to get me out of this. Have you ever thought that about your circumstances? It would be great if God just in a moment changed everything and took my problem away. And there are people that have these miraculous stories of how, like, something that was supposed to be big, some medical test that revealed some huge life-threatening problem, suddenly everything was reversed, or it came back that it was wrong, or this or that. And there are times when God steps in and he completely takes us out of our circumstance. And that seems to be the first level kind of Jesus' prayer is, God, Father, you are the all-capable God. If there is a way, I want you to deliver me out of this circumstance. But then he goes back and he prays a little while longer, and the prayer shifts. And the second time he says, "Oh, my Father, if this cup can't pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done. I want you to do your will." And so now it's like he realizes as a result of praying, I think that this circumstance is necessary. In fact, he knows from Scripture that it is necessary. And sometimes we come to that realization, God's not going to get me out of this. I'm going to have to walk this road even though I don't want to. Even though it's depressing and discouraging and all that weights on me, like God's got this for me for one reason or another that I don't understand. I'm going to have to walk that road. But God seems to think this is necessary. And then again, that phrase, he says, "Your will be done." He goes back a third time and says, "God, you do your will." So that's the submission. That's, again, in line with that Shema prayer saying, Father, you are king. I'm here to do your will. I'm here to bring glory to you. I'm here to follow your commands and submit to your will. So do your will. And that's really what loving God with all our heart, our soul, and our mind is all about. About 100 years after Jesus' death, there's a period of war between the Jews and the Romans. And there was a Jewish sage named Akiva. And the Romans said, you can't teach Torah. You can't teach the Old Testament of the Bible. But he refused to submit to the Roman authority, and he kept teaching the Torah, the Old Testament anyway, to people. And so the Romans, they decided to execute him. And as he was going to his execution, he came to this realization. He said, all my life I read this verse, love God with all your heart, soul, and strength. All the time I read it, and I said, when am I possibly going to be able to do all three at the same time? When will I have occasion for these three? You'll love God with all your heart, your soul, and your might. He says, I love God with all my heart. I loved him with all my money, which is how he translates or perceives might, everything that God gave me. I love God with all my money, but he said, I never knew if I could love God with all my soul. But now he said, when the time of with all your soul came, as he was being killed, and he had always taught that all your soul meant, even in the face of death. He said, now I can honestly say that. And according to the story, he actually laughed as he was being killed because he realized, oh, finally, I love God with all my heart, my soul, and my might. I can say I honestly did that. And that's what Jesus was looking for. And that's, I think, hopefully the process that even our sorrows and our griefs bring us to as well, where we can look at that as we go through that and say, this is very difficult. It's the worst thing I've been through in my life. But I'm staying focused on God. I want his will to be done. And I'm going to try to love him with my heart and my soul and my might as I go through this. I want to just kind of summarize some applications from this, 4 different things that I think we can take away from this. And again, you might be there right now, or this might be something that you haven't really encountered to this degree. But when you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders, and undoubtedly we're going to at times, first of all, be encouraged. God can relate. Jesus has felt the severe depression of detesting every single thing about his present circumstances. If you felt that way, God in the flesh has felt that way. He can relate. Secondly, when you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders, don't forget to confide in some of your closest friends. Maybe not everybody gets let into how your soul is, but give your closest friends a window. And if you're on the receiving end, if you are that friend that someone invites in and shares these things with, stay present, stay prayerful, stay connected, keep checking in on how this person's doing and their status, because they've got you close to them for a reason. They need support. Thirdly, implement a simple and consistent practice to focus your spiritual attention. I mentioned the Jews, they recited these Old Testament scriptures. The early church actually changed this. They adapted this practice a few decades after Christ's death and resurrection. And what they did was they took Jesus' Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, your kingdom come, your will be done. And they would recite that as a way of focusing them in on some of the key things that they needed to be, their purpose is really as believers. And I'm not telling you that you need to do that, but perhaps having a simple practice to focus you in every day and kind of evaluate who you are and who God is might be a good thing. And then finally, when you do feel like you're being pressed, you're in Gethsemane, come before God in prayer. It's good because it's a process that helps us to realize what God's will is. You know, maybe God does want to deliver you out of your circumstances and change everything, but maybe God wants you to accept it. And I know I was praying on the way to the hospital with my son, God, just make everything disappear. But he didn't. But he allowed me to kind of trust him and accept what I was going through, you know. And perhaps there are reasons, certainly there are, why God's allowing us to go through the things that we do. And with Jesus, it's very evident why God had him go through the things that he went through, because our salvation wouldn't be possible without it. Let's go ahead and pray this morning.